I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Zeus, Hera, Apollo, and Poseidon. It's a pantheon of Greek gods that have been part of popular culture for centuries. Just saying those names conjures up visions of epic stories and epic monsters. Of course, not all gods are so lucky to be remembered like that. There are gods from the 80s with names like Vestron Video and New World Pictures and Empire Pictures and United Film Distribution, and just to bring it back to the Greeks, Gorgon Video. And they've faded into obscurity. These distributors from the heyday of the 1980s horror film, they may be gone, but the epic stories that they told, and most importantly, their epic monsters, live on. These companies, along with some misfit filmmakers, some rich dentists looking for Canadian tax shelters, gore magazines, and the birth of home video helped usher in one of the most prolific and influential eras in horror film history. And now there's a new documentary in the works that has the potential to become the definitive look at the wild world of 1980s horror. It's called In Search of Darkness, a journey into iconic 80s horror. And on October 4th, the production launched its crowdfunding campaign on Kickstarter. And the idea has already landed horror icons like Mick Garris, Stuart Gordon, Joe Dante, and Sean S. Cunningham for the documentary, as well as influencers like former editor-in-chief of Fangoria magazine, Michael Gingold, and film critic and writer Scott Weinberg. And today, I'm happy to welcome two members of the creative team behind the film. David Weiner is a veteran entertainment journalist who spent 13 years with Entertainment Tonight, and he's the executive editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland, and he's won 3 Rondo Awards, and he's now the director of this documentary. And Robin Block, who is the founder of Creator VC and the executive producer for the documentary In Search of Darkness. David and Robin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm really, being a fan who was a teenager in the 80s, I saw many of the films that we're probably going to talk about in the theaters and on home video. So this documentary is very intriguing to me. And you have to have a certain mindset, I think, to want to do a documentary about the 80s horror scene. So before we go down that rabbit hole, I always like to find out a little bit about you guys. What was your first kiss with horror, the movie that changed or ruined your life? David.
Yeah, good question. I had access to a small black and white television growing up in the 70s when I was a kid that was on as often as I could have it on. And I grew up on a diet of classic Universal monster movies and Godzilla films and so on and so forth. Even Roger Corman B movies, Wasp Woman, all that kind of stuff came and went through my mind, and it really made such an impact. But I think it really wasn't until I saw Halloween, John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween, on TV, because of course I was too young to see it in the theater, and there was no way that I should have seen it in the theater. But somehow the planets aligned, and my entire family was not home, but I stayed home. So of course I turn on the TV, and lo and behold, there's Halloween, and I'm like, oh my God, I've been hearing everything about this. I have to see this movie, and that was the one, probably the greatest mistake of my life and the greatest memory of my life that probably got me on track to being just absolutely obsessed with the genre and with filmmaking and with how you construct a movie that could scare the pants off you. And so that's pretty much the answer. There's more to it because we're doing a film about the 80s, and I would just like to add that An American Werewolf in London is the film that cemented it for me, because that's the film where already having been a Star Wars kid and learning about the behind the scenes makeup of a film and really what it takes to construct such a memorable thing for audiences. I saw American Werewolf in London, and I became obsessed with makeup effects, and I became obsessed with storytelling, because it was the first time I realized that you could tell a comedy and horror story construct and have it be so effective, so hilarious, so scary at one time. So yes, those are kind of 2 kisses, one on each cheek.
Right. And I will say that I hear Halloween quite a bit, and also American Werewolf. And American Werewolf is one of those extremely rare films that does both the comedy and the horror equally, whereas usually there's a little bit of a skew. But Robin, what about yourself? What is your first kiss?
So, my earliest memories of watching horror movies is actually as quite a young child, watching it with my mother. And I grew up in a single parent family. And so that was almost like a ritual for us on a Saturday evening. We'd go and get pizza. We'd drive down to the video shop. We'd pick a video and watch it. And my mum wasn't really that familiar with the rating system. For my 10th birthday party, we got Night of the Living Dead and RoboCop to watch, which is pretty cool. But my first kiss, I suppose, I would have been very young. And it was the chest busting scene from The Thing, which I'll come to later. And obviously, David referenced, there's moments in your life where movies profoundly affect you. And I think, honestly, that as a sort of young teenage boy is probably the prime years to indulge yourself in 80s horror, because everything really works at that age. And you talked about American Werewolf in London. I remember watching it. I was off school. I was ill. I videoed it. It was on TV. I videoed it, watched it, and it scared the hell out of me. And I couldn't look in the mirror, because if I looked in the mirror, I thought there was my friend behind me, my dead friend behind me. Like, I didn't have a dead friend, but just that, when stuff sticks in your head, right? And so The Thing was really my first kiss. And what's remarkable about that movies, and in every era you get movies which are sort of untouchable and perfect, and they're almost fossilized in amber. They don't age, they're timeless. The Thing is one of those movies. I watch it almost every year. This year, my wife and I watched all three versions, the original Thing from Another Planet, right? And in the recent recent remake, and it's still, John Carpenter's interpretation is still a perfect universe is probably the best way of putting it.
Agreed. And I will say that I have a story about how that was very formative. And it's funny that you watched all three of those, because the first two, the impact of the difference between those two really shook the horror universe, to say the least. And now my first kiss was a little esoteric, I guess. I was 8 years old and I saw Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now. Very inappropriate time. Yeah. And I mean, I'm 8 years old. An 8-year-old girl is drowning. Donald Sutherland is falling apart. And it was very formative for me, because at that point, my family life was falling apart. And I didn't realize how much that film was able to help me turn on and off the terror. But at first, it gave me nightmares for 3 days straight. I wouldn't tell my family why I was having the nightmares, because I was afraid they'd never let me see another horror movie if I did that. But yeah, that was extremely powerful for me. And The Thing was extremely powerful because it was a moment between myself and my dad that changed everything forever. It was when we obviously realized that we were not going in the same direction in the world. But before we get too deep into that, Robin, what compelled you to make a documentary about 80s horror films in particular?
I'm 40 years old. I'm really lucky. I've got a wonderful wife and a beautiful little daughter. And the last couple of businesses that I ran were production businesses. That's been my background was in documentaries. And I was doing the work for money. I wasn't really intrinsically rewarded. So at the beginning of this year, I chatted to my wife and I said, look, I want to start a new business. The era that we're in, like right now, we're on a podcast. If I looked at your Twitter account or your Instagram account, it's almost like a personal fingerprint. Mm. So we're living in an environment now where media is heavily fragmented and people really tap into special interest niches. Mm-hmm. And you combine a special interest niche with the mechanism of crowdfunding, and you get a scenario where you can deliver the capital to produce creative works. So the first project that I funded was a feature-length documentary about 1980s action movies called In Search of the Last Action Heroes, with my friend and YouTuber Oliver Harper. Now that got funded. That's in production now, and that was just a wonderful journey. So much fun making it. And when we finished, I was like, well, what shall I do now? And it was sort of July, and I thought, well, what's coming up on the horizon that I think is significant? And I was like, ding, let's do something about 80s horror. And so my radar for projects, especially now, is something that I know what I'm trying to make. I know how I want to feel. And I just started working on it, and we had a really successful pre-launch phase. We started our Kickstarter on Thursday, the 4th of October, and within 48 hours, we'd hit our target. So it's been, I was right. I was doing it for the right reasons. The people that I've met along the way have been the best people. And it's interesting, coming back to what you said about the moment with your father, the people that love horror movies were always the ones who were the outsiders. They weren't necessarily the cool kids. That's why they liked horror movies. And it's that, the weird thing is it's counterintuitive, because I actually think the fact that all of us now, we've never, David and I haven't met physically. This is the first time we've met, but we're all connecting around something which is a shared experience. And, love of horror movies is about belonging, right? Mm-hmm. And so, when we look at 80s horror, what I want to achieve is to write a love letter to the genre. I want you to watch our film and immediately go out on a 12-hour movie binge marathon, right? And I want to connect you back to that feeling. Yeah, it's going to have levels and layers, and it's going to have contextualization, and what we're doing is really unique. But do you know what? It's just going to be really fun. And, my agenda and my responsibility is to deliver something that will delight this audience. And I'm part of the audience. I don't have to have the tattoos. I don't have to self-identify with the horror community. Maybe I will do after this, because it's been that much fun. But I know how I want to feel, and I want to take myself and the audience back to that place when we're 12 years old, getting our first kisses.
I just got my Hellbent for Horror tattoo.
All right, very good. I hope you got really big.
That's commitment.
Commitment. You're going to be like the NASCARs with every podcast that you're on. You get another tattoo as you're walking around. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned about the community, because that's something that on my podcast that I really preach, and in my book I talk about it as well, which is it's one of the oldest stories that has ever been told. Probably the first story around the campfire is "Thank you all for being here," and the second one was "Don't go out there. That's extremely dangerous, that spot." So you have the second story being the horror story, and I think it's still doing exactly what it did before, which is creating community and giving us a way to touch that shadow self, have that handshake that's safe as opposed to the one that is not so safe. And it also helps us deal with sometimes traumas that we may have had. Now, we're talking about 80s horror, and defining an era can really be difficult until some time passes. Most people usually define, say, the birth of what's called a modern horror film, either starting in 1960 with Psycho or with 1968 Night of the Living Dead. Because that was a huge shift in the style and the feel of the horror film before and after those two films. And in the 70s films, you had random acts of violence and a more realistic narrative. They didn't always end happy, and there was a cultural cynicism. So considering the era that we're talking about, and you're saying they're 80s horror films, what are the things that you think outside of the release date that makes what we call an 80s horror film separate from the other horror films that came before them?
It was a very unique time, because there was a transition in the way that we would view these films. It was physically different. We moved on from drive-ins and going to the theater and this sort of collective experience to almost a secretive, you got to see things oftentimes before you were ready to see it, by way of cable television or by way of VHS. That was brand new in the 80s. And so, audience would usually go to the theater if they could. If you weren't of the age, or just wasn't convenient for you, you still got to get your hands on these, whether it was when it was first came out or down the road a little bit. Sometimes it was your friend who had access, and your parents would never let you go anywhere near it. I think one of the defining components of 80s horror was the fact that you got to see this collective experience either all by yourself, not collectively, but with a collective, conscience in your brain, but you also got to see it with your pals. And it was a very sort of tribal experience. There's also another element, I think, where the 80s, where you really had this explosion, indie straight to video product, and you also had a preponderance of sequels that would come along. And we could obviously get into detail on this later, but I really define this as sort of the last, the explosion, and then alternately the last gasp of practical effects versus CGI that we know and sometimes are thrown by.
What would you say would be Patient Zero? What's the first movie that you say that is a definitive 80s film?
I think you have to go to the Carpenter and the Landis entries, Werewolf and The Thing, as probably the touchstone of the era. But that's really definitely on the higher end, because you have all these subgenres and you could really go into different ways. There are, it's not as entirely obvious as you might like to think.
Oh, of course not.
It's funny. I want to interject sort of a tangential thing, but I wanted to touch on it in that when I did first see Halloween on the small screen, on the small black and white screen within my small black and white screen, there's a moment where on Halloween night they're watching Howard Hawks' The Thing from Another World. And that was a moment that was only subconscious the first time I saw it, but it was sort of like an indicator of the layers and levels of filmmaking. And the fact that John Carpenter not only went to remake it, but he was sort of signaling that he was a fan of it and likely planning to do it at the time, and that you can reference these things. It basically, like in that context, it told me that on Halloween night, sci-fi can be just as scary and horrific as horror or slasher in terms of genre. And it really opened up my eyes to a variety of ways that you can approach storytelling.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because that is where I usually talk about how Carpenter is kind of a great figure for talking about the transition between the 70s and the 80s, because that Howard Hawks moment was what cemented my father into believing that The Thing was going to be his favorite movie in the world. And it did not end up that way, to say the least. But Carpenter, early on in his career, and we watched him a lot together, he had one foot in a very modern style, which I really loved, but he also had that Western kind of feel where people were straight talkers and there's a respectability. My dad called it classy, so it was something where for several movies, my father really loved this new director who felt like an older director. So he was a bridge between those two. And in Halloween, you see like the moment where everything's about to fall apart for poor John, because he's going to lose half of his audience. He's going to lose the older generation that came along with him to that point, because they felt as if a contract was broken, where he took a movie that was beloved by them and then turned it into something, as far as they were concerned, was somewhat blasphemous. It went completely against the grain of what they loved that first movie for, which is a lot about the cultural style and the cultural references that define that decade. So lots of times the cultural style or themes that define a decade don't start on those 0 years. So I think it's very interesting that both movies that you mentioned start in 1982, John Carpenter's The Thing and American Werewolf. Both happen in that magical year, 1982, where you have Poltergeist and several other films that came out. I think Videodrome as well. There were quite a few movies and I always think that that's kind of where the 80s start. But I'm not sure. Culturally, what do you think about the idea that in the 1980s, it's the first time that in the year 1980, we had a shift culturally with a president that was elected, who was considered somewhat of a vanguard, a change of the guard, that is, between what was acceptable and then what was going to be a different change. David, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, the perception of an actor as president and a whole other realm of us versus them sort of came into the picture there. And I think that really, especially with Carpenter and a lot of his later, whether you're talking about Escape from New York or They Live, it really was something that he wanted to say something about in the context of entertainment. It's hard to put my finger on how the seismic shift changed, but whenever you have a parable in film and stories that are reflecting the times, it often takes several years really to sort of for the filmmakers of the time to really understand what they're processing and to put it in their own films. So I would argue it wasn't really until the mid to the late 80s and the whole sort of Reagan presidency and American outlook, the Rambo outlook, so to speak, didn't quite embed itself into horror films.
It's funny that you bring up metaphor and allegory, which is one of the things, those are the things that I absolutely love about horror after buckets of blood and having a great time being scared. We mentioned Carpenter, and I can't help but talk about the allegory of how things did change in the 80s when you get to They Live. Now, if you were alive and of age when They Live came out, it was patently obvious who he was talking about as being the aliens. It's never inferred. He never says any political party. It's just the police and the poor and the well-to-do who are basically pulling all of the strings. But we pretty much knew who it was at that time. It was obviously the power structure. But recently, in the last 10 years or so, if you were to speak to some young fans who wear the Obey shirts and This Is Your God shirts, they'll tell you that it was liberals. And it's because of what their allegory is now, what they feel has been the problems that have put their lives where they are. In fact, Carpenter has had to go on Twitter and fight white supremacists who love to say that They Live is like the best white movie ever. Basically, they read in all of this stuff. So allegory gets a little bit crazy at certain points. And I love to hear a little bit, how about from you, Robin, what do you think were the cultural hot points that you can see over and over, even in the earlier 80s films, the horror films?
Well, that's something that we're definitely going to cover. It's the socio-political context. Now, before our main trailer landed, which is on our Kickstarter page, I did a teaser trailer, which proved to be very popular, an 82-second hardcore montage of 80s horror and 80s pop culture. And in that, there is three things that we reference. We reference Reaganomics. So when we talk about Reaganomics, we're talking about not just Reaganomics, we're talking about the Cold War, the fear of nuclear war. We've got AIDS, which goes back into body horror. We've got natural disasters. So obviously the Challenger disaster was a major thing as well. And so what you're tapping into is part of what is nostalgic about the 80s. This is before the internet. We look back at that time and we think, gosh, it was a bit simpler, but there was a real parallel to the time we're in now as well. So there a whole bunch of uncertainty, a whole bunch of fear. And that was seeping into the subtext and the influences for the work, and that's definitely something we want to tap into. So when I did the trailer, in fact, on the first poster, the portrait poster, we have a little boy looking into a TV, and I think all three of us are the little boy. Behind it, there is all these monsters, and as a bit of a trigger, I put Reagan in there. That wasn't some sort of comment. I just thought it was fun. There's nuclear bombs in the background as well, if you look. Yep. In the teaser trailer, I put in a picture of 80s era, a little clip of 80s era Trump as a bit of a trigger, because it's a bit fun to have a play on the internet with that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's something we're definitely going to talk about because it's contextualized. And you asked a question earlier about how do you look at an era? When we're making a film about 80s horror, it's expected that you're going to have 80s horror icons. But the purpose of this film is to look at the 80s from where we are now. And what we're doing that's unique, that's never been done before, is bring these three groups of stakeholders together. So you've got an amazing lineup of 80s horror icons. We've got some incredible modern contemporary horror greats, people like Lee Wanell, Ryan Turek from Blumhouse. We've got David Michael Latt, who's the guy that came up with the Sharknado franchise. But we've got this third group of stakeholders. And actually, you're part of it. So I call this group, and David's part of it, they're the influencers. And it's because of you. And I actually think you are the most important group when it comes to this documentary, is because we view this entire era through your prism now. So it's not only, an historical document, but it's also a love letter, because you wouldn't be doing what you're doing if you didn't love the work. It's only 30 years after the event now that you can start to really do that, and it's been so much fun, which is, I think, one of the things that's been a very core reason of why we're being successful with this project.
So sociopolitical context, I think, is always a tricky thing. And it's always a great thing, I think, when you're a filmmaker, because you could run the gamut. And this is not to character assassinate any particular filmmaker, but perception. If you have, Sam Raimi versus David Cronenberg, for example, you watch their films, and some of their films, it's just there's very clearly something more on its mind. Where other times you're just there to enjoy the ride and see the blood and the buckets spill and splatter as much as you can, depending on how you approach these things. And whether it's the great TV shows of the '60s, if you're talking about Star Trek or Twilight Zone, where I think people really for the first time really started to clue into the fact that sci-fi as parable could really comment on the politics and the social problems of the time, and tell great stories about them. Yet they could also just be seen as a straightforward story. I think horror in the '80s very much fits that mold, because it especially at the time was very hastily dismissed as just excess and entertainment and with nothing more on its mind. But it's only in the context of several decades later, or at least within the next decade, that people start to realize, perhaps depending on the filmmaker or depending on the audience member and how they approach it, perhaps there is more on its mind. People didn't quite realize that the filmmaking of the '70s was in large part, maybe say, a response to Watergate, depending on what film you're talking about. It wasn't really until the late '70s that you kind of figured out that was going on. And then there was a seismic shift, with the blockbuster age of, Jaws and Star Wars.
Sure.
The same could be said with the '80s and arguably the greed is good Wall Street diversion, where that and say Fatal Attraction really more defined the decade in terms of filmmaking and how people remember the social commentary of what was going on. It's really not until so much later that you could really apply that all to '80s, which I think is quite interesting.
Well, sure. And I think that's a very interesting point, because when I was growing up, I was growing up during that second golden age of Hollywood, where you have your Raging Bulls. Well, that's actually 1980, but your Godfathers and your Nashvilles and things like that. And at that point, critics were saying that movies could change the world. And so I grew up looking at movies in that kind of lens. And I just always thought that was in horror films as well, because there's so much allegory. And what I love about horror is that you can go there and have a message come to you, but you don't have to see it if you don't want to. You're still going to be entertained. If it's a good horror movie, you're still going to be entertained first. You're going to be scared first. There's not a necessity for you to get that message, yet at the same point, it can be a very bitter and vicious message, but it's not going to hurt like it would, say, if you were watching a drama. I always say that we can talk about anything in horror that we wish, as long as we get the allegory in place. There's always going to be a buffer zone between you and the real pain of whatever that terrible subject might be. And if you want to see what scared people, what pissed people off in any decade, just go back to the horror films and start taking a look at how there's a similarity in what people were afraid of. And you get an idea of where things were.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to interject that, as this is it's a UK-based documentary that's a co-production that's US and UK. It's all enveloping with the films from both sides of the pond, so to speak. But back in the '80s, the British were a lot less afraid to be critical of their own government, and so, it wasn't a horror film. But I remember a show called Spitting Image.
Yes, I remember Spitting Image,
which was very entertaining and very beyond sort of, say, Monty Python, which sort of hinted at a lot of that stuff, or was outright critical of church and state. I think the Thatcher era and the Reagan era were prime fodder for that kind of programming. And I think it seeped into the filmmaking to a certain degree as well when it came to horror.
Oh, sure. Cook, Thief, Wife, and Her Lover, Peter Greenaway's film. is, as far as I'm concerned, part Shakespeare, part horror film, all political.
Our culinary delight.
Yes, indeed. I was just at a film festival, and there was a movie that was doing the politics of today as a cannibalistic feast being put on for the rich, and just the way the bodies were, I was going on the plates. I was going. You saw?
Was that the Feast? What was the name of that movie?
It was called Feast. It's a short film.
Yeah, I thought it was. Yeah, okay. I haven't seen it, but I read about it. Yeah, it looked interesting.
Yeah, beautiful photography, and that one shot. There's two shots that you just, oh yeah, that's definitely Peter Greenaway. So we're talking about cultural shifts, and you hit on some really interesting ones. And I was thinking about the ones that I saw over the years, and I think Toby Hooper said something really interesting, and David, you kind of talked about this, which is, you make movies and you don't know what they're about for 20 years. That's at least what Toby said. You find the subtext later because you're so deeply imbued in it. And I look at it now with the cultural shifts that so much of this is about the anxieties of baby boomers, and they didn't even know that they were anxious yet. Some were anxious, others didn't seem anxious at all. But if you look at it, moving from upstarts to establishment really seemed to mess with the baby boomers quite a bit, and wanting to believe that things could get better. So you go from having downer endings to endings that sometimes were preposterous just to be able to give a happy ending. Then there's the fear of getting old. I mean, I remember when there was the Centrum Silver commercial. 50 is just the beginning. 50 is the new 40. And it's like wanting to
think. For 50-year-olds, I thought it was for the old folks.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's the new, the 40s are the new 30s. And so they were incredibly body conscious and healthy looking bodies, but not healthy looking minds, or you're taking so many drugs that your head's caving in on the inside. But the outside, what it looked like was so super important. So I think that's why guys like Cronenberg were so important. I think he saw the facile nature of all of that. And then you have the religious backlash that was happening against progressive lifestyles that were happening before that. And you can see how the marriage of certain religious groups and certain political groups in the 80s, probably on both sides of the pond, certainly pushed an outsider brand on both music and film, heavy metal being the music for the most part. Some punk was still around, but also for movies, the horror film was just the redheaded stepchild. And I think horror films took umbrage of that and just decided to push it even further, where we get towards the idea of the slasher film. But tell me what you guys think are the different types of horror films, because everybody thinks slasher when they hear the 80s, but I think it was actually a pretty diverse time for horror films. What do you think about the different styles of horror films and the kind of things that we were just talking about in cultural shifts?
I was just thinking about it because I don't necessarily... I look at 80s horror in a really highly subjective way. So I don't categorize them outside of 80s horror. Like each one is like a different is like a different friend to me. Like I've interpreted it quite uniquely.
If I could just interject, I think a lot of people like to categorize things like there's body horror,
right?
Or there's splatter, splatter gore, or so on and so forth. But I think, there were still lots of hybrids in terms of the genre where, there were a lot of fantastic fantasy elements. I mean, there was a huge amount of supernatural. Slasher was really other than, say, Michael Myers, The Shape, and Halloween, who was superhuman to a degree, but then just became the Jason of basically unstoppable Terminator style antagonists. But as soon as you went into, say, Friday the 13th, you went into Hellraiser, you went into Child's Play, it very much firmly had a foot in the supernatural and the fantastic. But yeah, I mean, there's animals, there's alien connection. There's a variety of things. There's the
they brush up against each other.
Lycanthropes. Go on. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's interesting. So one of the lessons that I've taken from this project is the next time I do this, I'm just gonna start with a list and say this is the 80s horror list. Now, when I started this project, I reached out to a friend of mine now, a guy called Derek Schweigart, who runs the website 80shorror.net. And he's got this brilliant blog post, which is 100 movies from 80s horror, right? And I was like, okay, that's the list. We're just going to stick with this list because hey, I didn't write it, and he's got who better than the guy that's got 80shorror.net. But the reality is, it's highly subjective, and I'll give you a story. So when we were editing the trailer, which is on our Kickstarter page, which is 3 minutes 39 seconds of awesomeness, my editor Nick and the team that were working on it had this discussion about what was 80s horror and what wasn't. Sure. And it was like the most stupid discussion because I was like, Nick, that isn't 80s horror. And he said, well, why? And I went, well, I can't give you any sort of reason apart from in my own tiny brain, it doesn't resonate with me as 80s horror. So, in the trailer, we've got, there's a couple of pieces from Monster Squad. There's a piece from.
I knew you were going to mention Monster Squad.
Right. There's even a shot of Gremlins, which is really because we've got Joe Dante on board. But we're not saving lives here. So I don't mind. I got asked today on Twitter. I said, someone said, "Oh, is the Predator and are you doing Aliens?" And I was like, no, because for me, they're sci-fi films with horror element. Alien isn't a horror film to me, but then Chud is. I can't, if I was in a court of law, I would probably go to prison because I can't justify my decision-making apart from in my brain, which is tiny. So I'm just saying this to everybody. If there's a film that we don't cover or we cover a film that you don't think is 80s horror, it's probably my fault. So I'm very sorry about that.
I don't think you would go to prison based on those choices because I think the fine lines are not so defined.
Right.
And there's lots of gray area. There's lots of crossover. So I don't think you would personally be held accountable to sticking to certain things because there's so much that's up for interpretation that I think even with our documentary, which we plan to release as a 90-odd minute release with an extended 3-hour version, you still can't really say these are our parameters because I think it's really up to the audience. We cannot. It's not our job. It's not our place to tell the audience exactly what the parameters are. But it's definitely most definitely implied by us, and what we will cover and the tangential gray areas that we'll dive into when we really get into the weeds. I think it's all inclusive and fun and qualifies. And, we're not going to be talking about Out of Africa is not going to make the list.
Right. Well, yeah. I will say anybody who listens to my show knows that I just can't stand labels. And that comes from being in the 80s and being a guy who liked metal and punk at the same time. And those two twain shall never meet at that point. And I was like, how could people who are so passionate and such outsiders quibble so much over something like that?
It's an amazing thing you just said there, because I'm reading a book by Alex Cox at the moment called
Alex, good old Alex.
X films, and X is the Roman numeral for 10. So he's talking through all his films, and then my favorite Alex Cox movie is Repo Man, and
of course,
it's a very special movie for me. So. And he's talking about the punk scene in LA, and the fact that they hated the metal guys and how there was all this sort of politicking and politics and labeling going on, and it's quite interesting. Just to sort of bring that back over to the documentary, the guy that we've got to do the artwork is a guy called Graham Humphreys, who is, if you're in Europe, he is how you first interpreted 80s horror. So he did all the poster and cover art for Nightmare on Elm Street. He did the iconic cover art for Evil Dead, if you're in Europe, and lots of others. So commissioning him for our landscape image, which is, if you go to the Kickstarter, it would be the first image that you see, was amazing. Now, he was around that time. He was a UK punk. He was, he'd been out drinking with Alex Cox and that sort of stuff. And, there is something very punk rock about 80s horror, which I just think is just effortlessly cool, and it comes out. And in the little teaser trailer, we included a little snippet of Wasp in there just to sort of satisfy the metalheads. But, I think what we're doing is punk rock, it's just, you just want to make something that makes you feel cool,
Sure.
It's a five categorization. It's funny, you were talking about what the focus was on while these movies were coming around and being released. And I think there was a lot of leeway in being the MPAA was not really focusing on these. They weren't handing out X left and right like they were to Midnight Cowboy and Clockwork Orange,
right,
because the definition of X changed. And I think as the definition of X changed in the early 70s, you had a change in the ratings and the process where I might have my timing wrong, but Tipper Gore takes on the music industry and wants to do ratings for the music industry.
Mm-hmm.
There's a focal point that's somewhere else and not on horror, which really allowed it by way of the fact that there were so many that went straight to cable and straight to video. I think people really weren't paying attention other than the fans themselves. And because there was a lot of nebulous sort of arbitrary placement on what qualifies for an R or an X or an NC-17 film, I think that's one element that's so special about the 80s is really with the excessive nature of the gore and the makeup effects, you really could get away with anything. And even Cronenberg, and we referenced Videodrome, and you could really get away with some horrific ideas and horrific psychological dramatization without it really making the cover of Time magazine in that decade. Sure. And I think that's really something special about the decade.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned Videodrome, because that's the one time that he started getting into trouble, and that's because there's some sexuality that's in there that's a little bit transgressive, and that's when horror ended up getting into trouble. A lot of times was any time that sexuality and horror and violence mixed. And we mentioned punk rock, and my thing was I talked about slashers a lot on my show. I'm not a particularly large fan of them, but when they first came out, it was punk rock as far as I was concerned. You had this thing where it was like, what are the rules? We don't care. Arrow in the eyeball. That's going to be what we're going to be talking about for the next week. And it was like so transgressive and so refreshing. But unfortunately, it ended up within 2 years, I'd say. I really liked 80 and 81 slasher films. They were brutal. They were ruthless. They didn't know what they wanted to do. They were just, anything could happen. And then it slowly became a template. But we're talking about things that are kind of cultural movements that aren't planned. They're just cool. And if you look at it, the comic books, newspapers are running out of money. They were losing their listenership and readership, that is. And so they cut out the funny pages and put them in a book. Bang. All of a sudden you have this weird thing, the comic book. And punk rock, you had the White Flight in New York City and all the artists just squatted in places. Then you have this guy who has a terrible nightclub and he'll let anybody play. And before you know it, you have these two things coming together for filling a void and also taking care of some money that's needed. So let's talk a little bit more. We talked about some of the philosophy of the 80s horror film, kind of background to them. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts. How in the hell did this happy accident ever happen? So one of the things you talked about earlier, David, was home video. And let's talk about home video and how people got money to make this stuff as well. So what are your thoughts, David, on, say, the home video revolution?
Oh, yeah. It just made it completely accessible. And it's funny, I remember even with cable, my parents didn't have cable. They didn't want cable. They wouldn't pay for cable. So I had to seek out very specific friends when I wanted to see very specific things. So, they were good friends of mine. But boy, if I'd look at the listings and if Humanoids from the Deep was playing one place, I'd go to my friend who had HBO.
Right.
Friday the 13th was playing, I'd sleep over at my friend who had Showtime. It was that kind of arrangement. Of course, they had Atari and I had Intellivision, so they got equal pay when they would come to visit me. But I wanted to sort of mention also, again tangentially, but relevant to what we've been talking about, is that many artists, when they create art, there isn't a political statement, and if it is, they don't want to declare it.
Sure.
And people want to put politics onto it. They aren't going to accept it or reject it, and they're just going to say art is art's sake. This is my statement. Take it or leave it. I am not going to interpret it. Exactly, I'm not going to interpret it for you. And I think a lot of that qualifies for these. And many, over the years, no matter what decade, there have been many artists and filmmakers who have been falsely accused of being more political and intelligent, and intellectual with their output than they ever intended. And they just said, "Hey, I like the color green, and it's not a political statement, yet it changed the nation." It is what it is. Going back to the accessibility of all this stuff, I think a key element is, where did they get the money for this stuff? It starts with I had the privilege of working, because I live in Los Angeles and I've been out here since 1990. I worked at the American film market for a couple of years, and I also, one of my first jobs was with Full Moon Entertainment, Charles Band's
Yes.
Empire before that, and well known for Puppet Master and the franchise and so on and so forth. I actually worked on Puppet Master 3. I worked on the first Demonic Toys. I worked on Netherworld. The greats of that kind of thing. And they had an arrangement with Paramount at the time where none of their films were getting theatrical, but they were getting, I think, 12 to 15 releases a year through Paramount Home Video. So those movies were kind of taking over because there was only a select amount of movies that got a real big piece of the pie when it came to marketing and distribution. And one of the joys of being a fan and just a movie lover is going to a video store and going and looking at the shelf and saying, "I have never heard of this. I've never seen this. But what is the art telling me? Who is in this? Is there even one of the Z-list actors that is either a favorite of mine, or I know they'll take their clothes off?" And that's definitely a selling point. And I bring up the American film market because that's really where I learned that so many of these films are sold from not a script and not a produced piece, but an idea, a bunch of names, and some really, really effective artwork. And that's really how these would get funded.
Oh, I remember Screamers and Microwave Massacre, those two covers.
Especially the artwork for Microwave Massacre is just phenomenal, isn't it?
Oh, it's magnificent. And Screamers is great because I think it's Wynorski. It was actually a movie, I think it was called Invasion of the Fishmen or Land of the Fishmen. And they just changed it into Screamers and says, it will turn you inside out. And you have this inside out guy. There's no inside out guy in the movie. But it made a fantastic box, and I got it because of that. I think it became a little bit cheaper to make these things when VHS really hit and tape became really cheap. I mean, tape was used on television since the 50s, but they thought so little of it. They recorded over all these big movies and stuff and big shows. They recorded over Super Bowl II. And so in America, that's like, I don't even know how they did that, but that's how little money that they thought was in this. And I think one of the things that really helped with horror in the 80s was that people didn't know what it was worth. It was making tons of money hand over fist for a bunch of people. I mean, and there was so much of it. I think from 1980 to 1989, there were 628 horror movies released.
Wow.
How many of those made the theaters? I can't tell you. In the year of 1987, the heyday, the real nadir, there were 111 horror films released. That's almost a third of the days in the year. There was a horror film that could have been equivalently put on that. And there was tax shelters that were being done in Canada. So you could make these you get a dentist, like I was saying. A lot of times that was the big joke. If you want to get a movie made, find a dentist in LA and he'll put some money.
Like in Ed Wood.
Yeah, Ed Wood, exactly. And so there are, especially the slasher craze, there was a lot that happened because of Canadian tax shelters where they deduct 100% of their investment if you had a Canadian crew and all of this. So you had movies coming left and right. Some of them were great, like My Bloody Valentine is one of my absolute favorite slashers because it's just unpredictable and ruthless at that time. But we're talking about an international thing here. And of course, we're talking VHS in the United States. But you guys over in the UK had an interesting problem, the video nasties list. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, all right. So it's interesting. I'm just moving off camera. Okay, because you can see this. This is the Video Nasties, the definitive guide.
Awesome.
Right. So the Video Nasties is probably something we'll definitely touch on in the documentary, but because it was a uniquely British phenomenon, that story's been told really well a number of times. And what we're trying to do with our film is really focus on the US audience. So you guys had a different story, but video. I grew up through it. I remember reading about, it was Peter Jackson's first movie, Bad Taste, which was banned. Right now, I remember the artworks. I remember seeing it in the newspaper when I must have been a little boy, and then a few years later, a channel in the UK called BBC Two had this season of films which was introduced by Alex Cox, and it played Bad Taste, and then it played a documentary about Bad Taste, and I think it was the first time it was aired on terrestrial television. And Bad Taste is not a horror movie. It's like the funniest thing ever. It's the best. It's the best.
Right.
It's the best student film ever made. And it was just. It was fascinating, but Video Nasties were amazing, and they had this legendary folklore about them. So we would see the things on VHSs that had been bootlegged 3 or 4 times, where the tracking was just off. And I'll give you a story from my own life. So I was 16 years old, and I was working in Pizza Hut. Give them a plug, and. One of the films that had this folklore and this mystique about it was The Exorcist. And I know it's been veering away from 80s horror, but there was no release. It was still banned in the UK. And I found out that there was a screening at a cinema like miles away from where I was growing up. And I convinced a friend of mine that had a car and could drive. Can we go and see this movie after our shift? And I remember it's one of the most memorable experiences I've ever had at the cinema, because we walked in. There's all these people with their girlfriend, all these guys with their girlfriends, and they start playing this movie. And I remember looking around, and girls were running out of the cinema, and and the girl sitting to me next to me was saying to my friend, "I can't watch this." And it was a grainy cut. You could see the marks on the print. And I couldn't sleep that night. I was amazed. It was incredible. Now, years later, when I was at university, I actually released The Exorcist for a cinema release in the UK. And I watched it, and it was weird because it was completely demystified. It had lost its power. And so there was something very powerful about being told you can't watch these films because they might break you. They might harm you psychologically.
Right.
You mentioned Tipper Gore, David. Tipper Gore was the best thing that ever happened to the rap music industry, because, you whack a parental advisory on a CD and your sales treble, right? So, it's very much like that. It tapped into that sense of forbidding, seeing things which you're not allowed to see. And a big example of that, which is 80s horror, was obviously like Evil Dead. That caused a furore. And if we're talking about kisses, I have a very vivid memory of my friend bringing that over on VHS. I watched it. I remember jumping off the sofa, like just being absolutely, completely scared. And isn't that wonderful? That you get those memories from it. So and it's a shame, because we're in the internet age now, where there's nothing that's inaccessible anymore. It's like what has to happen for us to be scared, and I think it's much harder for filmmakers nowadays.
It's almost the gimmick. I mean, again, we're sort of jumping out of the decade in terms of context, but you talk about the forbidden nature of being able to watch The Exorcist without it being a condoned in theatrical release. My mind goes to when I first saw the Blair Witch Project, because I was one of those people who, when before it was a theatrical sleeper phenomenon, it was circulated on VHS. And that's the thing, is I literally had people who said, this is supposedly, they would say it's true. They didn't even say supposedly. This is going around. It's real. Everyone's talking about it. We've got to see it. And that may be the last time I ever got together with a group of friends collectively to sit in a dark room and pop in this mystique of a tape that we weren't even supposed to have. And, Dramamine that I didn't take aside, watching this and trying to make something out of it, and just being mesmerized by the fact that absolutely nothing is happening, but something might be, because we were sold an idea. We were sold an idea that this is real, and that made it that much more compelling. It's a hard pill to recreate and make other people swallow in this day and age, but it's possible.
Oh, certainly. It's funny, a couple things. Bring up Evil Dead. I remember when it came out in the theaters. I got to see it in the theater, and they had no rating for it, but they didn't know what to do, so they put 2 R's. Right? It was rated double R in my hometown. But the thing that you mentioned about banning, we didn't have banning. We had Blockbuster Video and many chains that you couldn't get certain movies, and that brings up another thing. It was like punk and heavy metal, bootlegs. There were a lot of movies that we saw in a very wavy, grainy bootleg fashion that gave the movie a mystique and a reputation. Several of the movies that we watched that we called 80s films were actually movies that were made many years earlier, never got seen except for in grindhouses in 42nd Street, and then came out on video through some of the smaller groups that were out there.
Faces of Death.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, I might have stole your punchline, but that was the experience.
Oh, yeah. For me, it was Last House on Dead End Street, this crazy, crazy movie from the early 70s that didn't get released outside of a very short thing. But everybody talked about this movie where they were sawing a woman's arms and legs off and putting smelling salts under her nose to keep her awake, and some guy getting raped with a deer hoof. And you're like, what in the hell? I've got to see this. And you finally see the movie, and it's just the only time it had a mystique was when it was a bootleg that was almost impenetrable. It was like the 5th generation or something, but that gave it a reality, and kind of like what the Finleys did with Snuff. You know, Snuff came out in, I think, 76, but it didn't really hit until the 80s when it finally got a video release and it just had Snuff on the box. And talk about being sold a bill of goods. I mean, you have a small 5-minute nothing movie on the end of this movie that they couldn't even distribute beforehand. So it's interesting that we all have those kind of spiritual kind of connections with these movies, the mystique of those movies. And the 80s films that came on bootleg were certainly that way. And we had an underground of kids who would come and bring the worst of the worst that wasn't allowed in Blockbuster and stuff. And when you finally do see them in their pristine view, like Last House on Dead End Street had Barrel Releasing did a version that was cleaned up. It looked like a home movie. And you're going, oh man, this is just not the movie anymore. So everything comes to an end. And what do you think killed the 80s horror film?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's it wasn't necessarily a death at the end of the 80s. I think it continued to thrive. I just think that the audience perhaps grew up, perhaps matured, perhaps went beyond to get more diverse fare. And I don't agree that it did necessarily die. But the obvious answer you could probably say is the digital revolution and CGI. That really put a stake, in the way films were made. But the independent films really thrived in the early 90s. But I think you could argue that in terms of genre perception, you might even throw, Quentin Tarantino and Pulp Fiction in there as well. Kind of like grunge killed, the 80s synth. You basically had a pivot in terms of what everyone wanted to make and when everyone thought was going to make them money. And horror movies were not quite there anymore. Horror movies were getting less and less expensive, and it showed. And I think people's perception of that had changed and what they wanted to invest in when you were talking about producers. And when you talk about Hollywood, you talk about producers, while horror has always been an absolute mainstay, and to this day it thrives as a low budget moneymaker and alternative. I think the way people were looking at film, they didn't think that was where the money was being made anymore.
Right. I think what you said is accurate. I also think that one of the changes, what I call the 90s drought, happens because we have this glut of low budget horror films that are there. And then overnight, what was it, February 14th, 1991, Silence of the Lambs. And all of a sudden, everything goes from horror to thriller. And you have a movie which was considered a horror film on February 14th, 1991, considered a thriller, and that's it when it got to the Academy Awards. And I think we got kind of saddled with a lot of low-budget thriller films as opposed to films that were going into the supernatural and stuff for a little bit of time. But of course, horror never truly dies because we need it. It is something that is a cultural need. And I just also, for me, it was fun. So I mentioned the pantheon of Greek gods at the start of the show. What horror directors do you feel are the 80s horror Zeuses that we should be talking about?
Well, I think we've cut. There's so many, but I think if you're talking about the gods at the top of Mount Olympus, it really is. Cronenberg. You've got Carpenter. Sometimes it just takes one film or two films. If you're talking about Tobe Hooper, you're talking about John Landis. Their forays into it. Sam Raimi. I directly go to kind of a laundry list, because some of these directors, when it came to the horror genre, they just they put one foot in, they made their mark, and then they left. And then there are others who stayed the course throughout the 80s. And so arguably you could go to a lot of these sort of indie low budget directors. You could even mention Tom Holland,
right.
for Fright Night and Child's Play. But it's all your perception. Because I think the great thing about the 80s is I think everyone, other than those top names that I mentioned, no one very specifically dominated. Everyone kind of had their turn. They kind of made their mark. They might have made a sequel or two, and then they left. And I think there was room for so many.
There's so much to talk about when it comes to 80s horror films. I'm sure we've only scratched the surface of what the documentary In Search of Darkness, A Journey into Iconic 80s Horror contains. Thank you so much for coming on the show, David Weiner and Robin Block.
It's been a real brilliant opportunity to be on your show. You two are like old friends, like just listening to you talk about riff about movies. We could be here for 4 hours, but thank you very much for having me on.
Can you tell us how we can keep informed about what's happening with the production?
Well, we're all across social media with the same handle, which is 80s Horror Doc. So 80s Horror Doc. And if you go to 80shorrordoc.com right now, you will be forwarded to our Kickstarter page where you can watch our amazing trailer. Follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram for all the updates, because this period that we're in right now, we've got so many amazing announcements for people that we're attaching to this project. And come and join us, be part of what we're doing.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that. And where can people get in touch with you directly if they so wish to find out a little bit more about how they can be involved in this in one form or another?
Well, there's myself and my head of PR, Jessica Dwyer, who are constantly monitoring the Twitter feed. So just ping us a message at 80s Horror Doc. We follow up with everybody. If you want to get in touch with me directly, you can send me an email. My email address is robin@creatorvc.com. And please do, all the way through this journey, people have been getting in touch with us with suggestions where, they want to help, they want to be part of production. We'll talk to everybody. This is for you, by you. This is funded by the fans. This is for the fans. And we're very inclusive. And, it's just been a wonderful adventure. I'm loving it.
I'd like to add that conventionally, although documentaries are so much more popular now in terms of, common acceptance of documentaries and perception of it. But some people still think that a documentary is kind of boring and kind of stodgy. And we definitely aim to, in the spirit of the movies that we're talking about and the era we're talking about, it's definitely going to be an entertaining watch.
If you're in London, we're having a party at a kung fu bar called Pimp Shui, which is one of the best dive bars in London. It's on the 26th of October. Come down. Myself, some of the team that are in the UK are going to be there. Some of the YouTubers that we work with are going to be there. Some of the horror influencers are going to be there as well. And just like David said, this is, there's meats, there's historical analysis, there's contextualization. But let's face it, I'm trying to make the most fun movie I can. I want this to be something like you're joining a group of friends, reliving your best 80s horror experiences. And that's the feeling I want to leave you with. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. And once again, that is the documentary In Search of Darkness, a journey into iconic 80s horror. And I want to thank my guests, David Weiner and Robin Block, once again for coming on the show. And I want to thank everyone who is listening for taking the time to do so. And feel free to email me with your own thoughts about today's episode. And until next time, stay hell-bent. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And in the wings is a Hellbent for Horror book entitled Screaming for Pleasure. I'm currently writing it, and we're shooting for a release in the fall of 2018. So spread the word and keep your eye out. More info on that later. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.